right now, we have attained this state with all of this sort of leisure and opportunity to be able to practice the Dharma. And on this occasion, while we have this kind of life, we should work toward having again in the future a good rebirth as a human or a god, doing so by abandoning harming other beings and working for their benefit, so that we might, by gaining a good rebirth after good rebirth, work toward this goal of Buddhahood by culminating, by sort of perfecting our practices of the various like generosity and ethics and so forth. And in order to do that, we are going to then listen to the Dharma. So with that kind of motivation, setting such a motivation, thinking that we are doing this for ultimately being able to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings, we are listening to these teachings. So here we're going to first address some questions that came up a few weeks ago that we didn't have a chance to get to. So the first of these is from the section that we covered earlier, I'll say. It seems that the idea that all the Buddha's teachings lead to suchness is a meditation object for developing serenity. So would you please explain the focal object and aspect for this meditation object and how one would meditate on it? So here, this was as we had earlier in the text, it says, the yogis who are interested in actualizing a serenity mind should initially concentrate closely on the fact that the 12 sets of scriptures can be summarized as all leading to suchness, that they will lead to suchness, and that they have led to suchness. So here, there's a kind of understanding that one needs to have, looking at the fact that all of the teachings of the Buddha are for the purpose of being able to realize emptiness, or for the purpose of attaining liberation. And so they are for us to be able to realize suchness, or realize the ultimate reality, the actual nature of things. And so in order for that to happen, we can see that teachings like the four seals, like all compounded phenomena are impermanent, and all of that is suffering and so forth. These are methods by which one is led to finally understand that the sort of more subtle selflessness, or this idea of emptiness. So we see that those kinds of teachings sort of point to, or take one, lead one toward suchness. And we can see also that the teachings on more coarse forms of selflessness, wherein it is taught that there is not a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, or no self that is a singular, autonomous, permanent kind of entity. These coarse levels of selflessness are for the purpose of being able to turn disciples toward realizing eventually that kind of ultimate reality. And so we should recognize that these various types of teachings, and finally those that actually teach subtle selflessness, that are really directly pointing at emptiness, these are all methods for disciples to be able to be led towards suchness, or enter into and understand suchness itself. And so these are what are summarized within the Buddha's teaching. So once we have sort of come to that understanding, we place the mind directly on that all of the teachings of the Buddha, all that's summarized in the Buddha's teachings, are really for that purpose of attaining suchness. And one places the mind on that kind of recognition or understanding. So this is also like the way in which we recognize that all phenomena are contained within the 5 aggregates, or those 12 sense bases and their objects, those 18 categories of phenomena. We go through initially looking at each one of them, and then come to the conclusion, well, all phenomena are contained within, or summarized within, those aggregates, and then place the mind on that understanding. So when we are looking at the teachings of the Buddha, we can investigate individually that there are various teachings that say teach the conventional, but that's just the conventional nature of phenomena. It doesn't get at the ultimate nature. And so recognizing that all of the teachings of the Buddha are for being able to come to an understanding of that ultimate nature, recognizing that, one then places the mind in that kind of understanding. And this is how it is a serenity meditation. So here it also it explains this in the Lamrim Chenmo, that all of the Buddha's teachings are sort of summarized, summed up in these baskets of teachings. So when we are doing this kind of meditation, one is observing that sort of like that the teachings are contained or that they are summarized in that, and one places the mind then on that object. It's sort of come from a kind of investigative understanding, but then one is placing the mind. So then the second question that we had was what to do when anxiety arises while one is meditating. So here, Geshe is saying that it's important to understand sort of what is the source of our anxiety? Why is this coming up? So we could have a situation like, say, you're meditating on emptiness, and that kind of strong sort of negation that comes in the course of meditating on emptiness leaves one with a kind of fear or anxiety. And in that case, one would want to then meditate on the sort of side of existence of looking at how things are dependently originated. So one isn't completely non-existent, but rather there is an undeniable sort of conventional level of dependent origination. And in that way, contemplating that helps to balance out the kind of anxiety that arises from meditating on emptiness, potentially. So, but if it's a case where we're like having some sort of worry or fear, anxiety come up that we need to maybe address, it's better maybe to get out of that meditation and actually address whatever's going on in our mind, because it's not good to sort of force ourselves to continue to meditate. If we're experiencing some kind of difficulty or body or mind, we shouldn't force ourselves, rather leave it for a little while and come back to it once we've addressed it. But it also depends again on what is arising in our mind. So if we have, say, jealousy coming up or anger, we need to work with a specific antidote to that particular affliction. So it's important to kind of identify what is it that we are anxious about, and then be able to work with that, whether it's taking a break from our meditation or using the proper kind of antidote. So again, in terms of working on meditative stabilization, when we are doing this practice, we need a relaxed and open kind of a mind, one that recognizes that this is a fortunate opportunity and has a kind of joy in engaging in meditation. If we're having a great deal of difficulty and we really aren't able to do it well, maybe it's better for us to leave it for some time rather than try to force ourselves, make ourselves continue to engage in this practice when it's actually not beneficial in that way. So as we talk about this, we need joyous effort, and joyous effort or enthusiasm comes from really having a joy in that practice. So we should be approaching this with the kind of attitude of this is a very fortunate opportunity with a relaxed and open mind. Because if we're engaging in this kind of forceful way where we're making ourselves do it, we're actually less likely to want to do it again in the future. It can become an obstacle to continued practice. So really, when it comes to meditating, if we are sort of unhappy or have some kind of mental disturbance, this is generally coming from having the 8 worldly concerns, from being caught up in those kinds of worldly activities. And so here, when it comes to really working on our mind, we are working on that sort of aspiration or attitude that we have, whether we are generating love and compassion or other positive sorts of attitudes and virtues. It's not really about the kind of external change in our behavior, but really the change in the way that we are thinking, the change in our mind. So it's not as though the sort of external expression or attitude that we put forth is going to have the dramatic change, but it's really about the sort of internal work on our own mind. And that's what should be the focus of our practice. So as for where we had left off then in the text, we had been looking at the selflessness of phenomena. So meditating on the selflessness of phenomena here means really in particular, first we looked at the way in which we grasp at external things like the form that is like form, sounds, smells, taste, touch, that which is contained within the 5 aggregates, or we can talk about it in terms of those 18 constituents, the sort of form that is included within those. So again, it says phenomena, in short, are included under the 5 aggregates, the 12 sources of perception, and the 18 aspects. And so here, these are not in the nature, they don't have any sort of real external existence, but rather are only something that is in the nature of mind. So when we examine and look for these kind of external phenomena, we can see that they are nothing other than aspects of the mind. So we have this mind of valid cognition apprehending phenomena, and we can speak of the sort of existence of that mind, but the object that it apprehends is like that of a dream. In a dream, we perceive things as though they were external, real objects of our forms and sounds and so forth, but they don't have any real external existence. They're only in the nature of that perceiving mind. And so the 6 types of beings, these beings that cycle through various realms, we see and encounter various objects due to the kind of awakening of predispositions that have been laid down on that consciousness. And so there's nothing substantially different than the apprehending consciousness. We can't find any sort of external existence apart from that perceiving mind. So here, this is expressing the view of the mind-only school, the Chittamatra, as well as a view that is espoused by the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka. So they would say that there is no external existence apart from the mind. There's nothing that one can point to as having external existence. Whereas when we look at the kind of view of the Sutra school, Svatantrika Madhyamaka, so this is the autonomous that are following the Sutra school, they would, like the Sutra school, assert that there are external phenomena, that we can point to and identify external phenomena. And the Prasangikas as well, they would assert that there are also external phenomena. So here, where it is saying that there are no external phenomena, they're only in the nature of mind, is expressing the mind-only kind of view. So here then, in terms of establishing that there are no external phenomena, one needs to give a reason. So here for the mind-only school, they present different kind of reasons why it is that we can't have this kind of external existence. So we have a perceiving mind, like when we have a mind apprehending, a visual consciousness apprehending form, there is the aspect of the apprehended, meaning that external form, and the aspect of the apprehender, or that apprehending consciousness. And they would say that those are actually not substantially different. They're of the same nature or essence, because we can't establish that there is any kind of external form. If things were established as existing externally, as having that kind of existence, then the following sort of problems would arise. This is just one particular reason as it's laid out in Vasubandhu's 20 verses. And here again, he's presenting a mind-only kind of position. So I'm not sure I'm going to get the verse exactly right here, but the thrust of the verse is saying that if it is the case that you are trying to assert that there is some sort of really truly existent external kind of particles, well, there's no way to posit the smallest kind of particle, which would in essence be a partless particle. Because if you have that kind of situation of a partless particle, then how can we talk about things coming together? So here, if it's the case that we are unable to say distinguish between the left side of something and the right side of something, that's what it would mean for it to be partless. You don't have any further kind of distinctions to make. Well, then how can those kinds of particles aggregate together? If we are going to talk about particles coming together, you have like 6 directions. You have, north, east, south, west, above and below. And those are the ways in which those would need to connect together. But if it's the case that we're saying that these things don't have any parts whatsoever, whatsoever, how can you have, like, say, any kind of conjoining between them? Because there's nowhere for them to touch. If you're asserting that there is no sort of particle, like there is no part to that smallest particle. So if you don't have, like, say, a right side or a left side, how can we talk about some other particle coming and conjoining with it? They would actually sort of like dissolve into the same space, would become a single thing. There would be no way, if you can't distinguish, so you have got your center partless particle, well, then there needs to be some way that it is connected with another particle. Is it at the top, the bottom, the north, the south, the east? If you can't make that kind of distinction, they're basically just collapsing, dissolving into a single space, into a single place. And if we don't have that ability for them to, like, connect or touch in some kind of a way, when they come together, they're basically just collapsing into one space because they're partless particles. Then how could we possibly talk about the aggregation of such particles to create bigger physical things? So if all sort of, if we're talking about like 6 particles trying to conjoin, are actually just going into the same spot, there's no way that you could have a larger particle. And so too, on the other hand, if you can't create that kind of aggregation of particles and create any sort of larger form or more coarse objects, then those sort of coarse things, we would also have to say, well, those are then the smallest particles. We can't have this kind of external existence because, as they've undermined here, we can't have a kind of a partless particle that's somehow able to conjoin or aggregate with others. And so even those kind of larger things, how would they be built up if they can't be an aggregation of these kinds of particles? So here, this sort of, when one is trying to find the smallest kind of external existence, it becomes like of infinite regress. One can't get to a point where there is such a smallest particle. So last time when we had been explaining, or earlier when we'd been explaining the selflessness, particularly selflessness of the person, we had been talking about the kind of faults that would incur if the person is essentially the same as the aggregates, essentially one with the aggregates, or if it's essentially different from the aggregates. So there are, as it's sort of listed out in the Lamrim Chenmo by Jelan Matsongkhapa, these 6 kind of faults that would occur if one were to assert that the self and the aggregates are essentially the same. So the first of these is that it's sort of like if these two are intrinsically or inherently the same, then there's no point in even asserting a self. So if it is the case that the aggregates and the self are exactly the same, it would be redundant to talk about a self. It's just like a synonym for the aggregates. And again, so just to step back, when we are going through these various reasonings, this is something where, yes, there's scripture that is cited, but we really shouldn't be thinking in terms of like going to a recited scripture. We can establish this for ourselves using reasoning, using worldly conventions and reasoning and thinking through this. We can actually come to an understanding of these various topics. We don't need to think that we should just be resorting to going to scripture to establish this. We think through these and we can logically establish it for ourselves. So if it were the case that we say we're to assert that the aggregates are the self, well, then there would be the second fault, that the self would become multiple. I mean, think about it. We have form and feelings and consciousness and discrimination and karmic formations. Well, then is our self 5 different things? Even within each of those, like our consciousness, we have different minds. And so which is the self? The self would then become multiple. And so that's the second kind of fault that would incur. And then there is the fact that if the aggregates were the self, then it really, sorry, this was sort of as it was, as I mentioned the first one, there's no point in talking about the appropriated and the appropriator. If it is the case that the one doing and the doer and the deed are the same thing, you can't separate out an action and an actor if they are essentially one and the same. So that kind of logic follows that if we are trying to say that the aggregates are the self, then those sorts of faults incur. occur. We can't talk about the sort of aggregates acting in any way, or the self acting with respect to the aggregates, because they are one and the same. And then if we have this if we are going to assert that the self is the aggregates, then say, for example, the form aggregate that we have doesn't continue beyond just this life. It's newly established in this life from the mother's egg and the father's sperm. And so there's no continuity of form through lives. And so if we have asserted that the self is the aggregate, then we fall into these issues of all of the kind of actions that we did with that form in a previous life, those kinds of karmas that we committed. Well, because there's no continuity of that form, those karmas would become wasted. They wouldn't ripen onto a form in the future, because that's a different self. It's essentially different from the earlier form that it created those karmas. So it would have the issue that we wouldn't experience the results of the karma. And then it would also have so karma would be wasted. We wouldn't have to encounter the results of the karma that we had created in the past in a different form. Because again, if we're identifying the self as being essentially the aggregates, and we had a totally different form aggregate in a previous life, then we're going to have this issue that those karmas are wasted. They're not actually going to ripen on that future self, if it's a different sort of a self based on a different kind of form. And so too, when we have this form that has been established newly in this life, well, we experience various sufferings on the basis of this form. Well, where did those come from? It would have to be the case that we are encountering karmas that we did not create. So these two faults are related to either creating karma that one doesn't experience the results of, or meeting with the results of karma that one had not created. And then there's the issue of being able to recall previous lives. If we have like the Buddha talking about, well, in such and such a life, I was this person, that wouldn't be a viable or logical thing to say. It's not tenable to assert that, given that there's no continuity between the form and therefore the self of this life and those of previous lives. So again, this is something that is not extremely hidden. It is something that these are points that we are able to know from really leading back to our own experience, our own direct experience of things. And so we shouldn't sort of think that these are concepts that are beyond our comprehension, or that we can't understand them, but actually we can develop an understanding through utilizing logic. So here then we turn to the kind of issues that would incur if we had a self that were essentially different from the aggregates. So if it were the case that the self is totally separate, different from the aggregates, then the self wouldn't have the characteristics of the aggregates. So if we were to say like, when your your form is sick, to say, oh, I am sick, you wouldn't be able to do that, because there's no essential connection between the aggregates, say what the mind thinks or what the body does, and that self, because we're asserting that they're essentially totally different. And so here, this is something that is really, there are different sort of things that are being refuted here in terms of refuting some kind of self that is totally separate apart from the aggregates. We can see that there's no way to actually assert such a self, because we can't have any sort of appearance of the self except on the basis of those aggregates, whether it's a form aggregate or feeling or mental consciousness. There's some basis for the arising of a sense of self. And so if there's nothing outside of the aggregates that we can identify as the self that causes that sort of appearance of the self to arise. Like when you have two distinct things, if you have blue and you have yellow, when blue arises, you don't have to have any sort of connection with yellow. Or when you have like your two hands, whatever the left hand is doing, the right hand doesn't necessarily need to be doing. They're actually totally independent. And if that is the case with the self and the aggregates, then there are multiple sort of faults that would incur. And really one of the most important points here is that the self has to be designated on the basis of the aggregates. There's no other place to put that. We can't assert that there is some self entirely separate and apart from the aggregates. Here, when we say, if our form aggregate, if we are walking along and we say, I'm going, I'm walking, that is conventionally acceptable when we sort of leave it at that level existence of merely being posited by mind, by saying that, well, I'm going, and that's the sort of level that we leave it at. That is totally conventionally acceptable. We can accept that we are going as our form aggregate is going. But when we look for and search for, well, where is the goer, or where is the self within that form aggregate? If we look for some kind of autonomously existing I, is there something that we can point to within that form aggregate? It's not the form as a whole. It's not just like the feet or something. It's not the motion of that. When we begin to look for it, we can't actually find something that we can point to as that the referent of our positing a self. When we leave it at the level of, oh, that's merely posited by mind, it exists in that way. But when we look for the thing itself within that basis of designation, we can't find something to point to that says, well, that is it. But we also can't say that there's no connection whatsoever. If the self is totally separate from the aggregates, then it wouldn't be logical in a worldly sense to say, I'm going, because there's no connection between that I or that self and the kind of the aggregates that are actually in motion. So this is something, again, that we are able to know through our own kind of logic and investigation. If we investigate and analyze, we can come to an understanding of this. And this is presented, the sort of logic that we go through is presented in two different verses. First, in a verse by Nagarjuna in his 22nd chapter of the fundamental verses on wisdom, an examination of the Tathagata, where he says, he is not the aggregates, nor other than the aggregates. No aggregates are there in him, and in the aggregates he is not found. The Tathagata is not the owner of the aggregates. What then is the Tathagata? And so then we'll also follow up with a verse from the Madhyamaka Avatara, Chandrakirti's work, where he describes sort of 7 different relationships. But here in this verse by Nagarjuna, we have these 5 different kinds of sort of relationships between the self and the aggregates. Here, the sort of Tathagata and the aggregates. So the first 2 express the 2 that we have already gone through, this sort of relationship between being inherently or essentially the same. So he is not the aggregates. The Tathagata, we can't say is the aggregates, nor is he other than the aggregates. Is the Tathagata something that is essentially different from those aggregates? And then we get into the 2 different sort of levels of understanding of inherently being the support and the supported. So we don't have a relationship. It says here, no aggregates are there in him. So if we take like, or the next line, and in the aggregates, he is not found. Here, these 2 are examining the sort of relationship of supported and support and supported. So we can't say that the sort of aggregates are essentially the support and the Tathagata is the supported or the thing that is based upon that inherently or essentially, nor is it the case that the Tathagata is inherently the support that is supporting the aggregates or that is holding up the aggregates. So those 2 levels of relationship are also not acceptable. And then we get to the 5th of these, which is the Tathagata is not the owner of the aggregates. So here, this is expressing like, again, a relationship of sort of inherence or kind of possession. And here we could have 2 levels of possession. There is possession or inherence where you're talking about things that are essentially different. Like say Devadatta owns some cows. He's possessing or holding on to something that is essentially different from him. Whereas if you are to say Devadatta has form, well, that's expressing something that is essentially the same. So you can have those 2 kind of relationships of ownership. So here, none of these alternatives are acceptable. It's not acceptable for them to be essentially the same, essentially different, to have a relationship of inherently supported and supported support and supported either way, or this kind of relationship of inherence. And so in their ultimate nature, there's nothing that we can point to that can be found when we talk about, and this is not just the Tathagata, about talking about the self or things, notions of good and bad and all of these things, etc. When one searches and tries to find that thing, there's nothing that can be pointed to. This is the kind of ultimate reality of. So normally we analyze in relation to ourselves. So here, like this verse that is analyzing the Tathagata, we should sort of be thinking about it in relation to our own sense of an I and sense of a self. So normally we have an idea of there being some kind of like an autonomous self that exists in its own right, that isn't just merely designated on the basis of that of our aggregates. And if it is the case that we had such a self that existed in that way that it appears to us, then it would have to exist in one of these various ways. It would have to be the same with our aggregates, essentially the same as those aggregates, or essentially different from the aggregates, or essentially supported by the aggregates, or essentially the support of the aggregates, or have this relationship of inherence, of like possessing the aggregates. And when we examine in any of these ways, there can't be such a self. There's not like say this in terms of the relationship of inherence. It's not like say the way that there are lions and tigers in the forest, or like Devadatta possesses some cows. We can't speak about these two essentially different things having that kind of ownership or possession, or nor in the sort of inherence in terms of possessing something that is essentially the same. So here, this I that it appears to us in terms of our innate mind, we have the strong sense of there being some kind of autonomous or self that exists in its own right. When we examine and try to analyze and find it, we can't substantiate its existence in any of these 5 ways. And so this is the kind of way in which we go through the meditation on insight. And once we have come to some kind of an understanding, we then can do placement meditation, where we are placing the mind in the kind of certainty that we have found. And this is the way that we gradually improve our kind of understanding of selflessness. So then Chandrakirti, in his entry to the middle way, adds 2 more sort of levels of analysis. So we have the sort of 5-pointed analysis from Nagarjuna, where he's explaining that the self and the aggregate has those 5 sort of extremes in terms of the way that the relationship could exist. And Chandrakirti expands this, adds 2 to make it a 7-fold kind of analysis. And he uses as an example a chariot, although we could maybe modernize that and use like a plane or a computer, or think about some sort of modern equipment. We have all kinds of things that we could use as a basis for investigating. And so if we say that there is a sort of thing, like say a plane or whatever it is, that is really truly existent, that is existent in its own right, we would have to be able to posit it as existing in one of these 7 ways. Now, again, we can posit something like a chariot as existing independence upon the basis of designation, like on the basis of its parts. We designate something called a chariot, but we can't say that it actually is its parts, that it, again, we have something that is designated, and the thing designated is not the same as the basis of designation. So here, to read the verse from Chandrakirti, he says, like a chariot, it is not thought to be different from its parts, not non-different, not possessing them, not within its parts, not containing its parts, not the mere collection or the shape of them. So here, when it comes to investigating, and again, we're using the basis of something like a chariot or a plane or whatever it may be, that's designated on the basis of all of these various parts, all of this metal and screws and bolts and all of that kind of stuff. We can't say that it exists as its parts, but it's not actually something that we could identify as being separate from its parts, nor does it have a kind of a relationship of inherence in terms of possessing it, nor is there this relationship of support or supported, as we saw in the earlier verse from Nagarjuna. Now, the two that are added, we say it is not the mere collection. So again, we're using this example of like a chariot or something, but really examining the self and the aggregates. So we can't say that the self is just a mere collection of those things, although that mere collection, say in the case of a chariot or a plane or whatever, is the various parts. We can identify those parts as being the basis of designation. The thing which is designated, the chariot, the self, whatever it may be, is not the same as that basis of designation. So here although we could assert that the mere collection is the basis of designation, that mere collection of those parts and so forth is not actually the thing designated. And nor is it the case that it's a sort of the shape or the arrangement of those parts that one can say is the thing designated. Again, although we designate, like say, a chariot, and that is something that is posited on the basis of designation, a set of particular parts, we can't say that it is its individual parts, nor is it aside from its individual parts, nor does it inherently possess those parts, nor is it inherently supported by those parts, nor is it inherently the support of those parts. It isn't the mere collection of those parts or the shape of them. And so this is the way in which we engage. And here, observing the self of the person, we investigate how could it exist in any of these 7 ways. And when we engage in this analysis and come to find that, well, it can't, if we had such an autonomous, really truly existent self, it would have to exist in one of these 7 ways. And when we come to find that it can't actually exist in that way, then we come to place our minds in that sort of understanding of selflessness that we have arrived at. So this kind of thought of I, it's actually said in the sutra by the Buddha that what is called self, like this thought I, is Mara's thought, is like a demon's view, and this would be your view. So when we have this idea of a self, when we are holding to an I, and we hold really strongly to that sense of I, we're then going to have a kind of attachment to our side and aversion toward the other, toward that we see as harmful to us in some way. And so it is on the basis of this grasping at an I and making a distinction between self and other, that from that all of our various faults arise, all of our various afflictions that compel us to engage in karma and so forth. And so as long as we have this kind of idea of an I that exists like autonomously in its own right, we are going to then perpetuate our existence within samsara. But there is no such I as it appears to us, as though it had some kind of existence in its own right or autonomous kind of existence, but it's something that is merely designated on a basis of designation. But we don't normally hold it in that way. We hold it to be like really truly existent. And so as it says, as this sutra continues, what is called self is Mara's thought, and this would be your view. The formation of aggregates is empty. In this, there is no sentient being. So it is like this thought is being compared to like a demon. This is a little bit sort of out of the way of this, but when we have this kind of thought of I and grasping at ourselves as more important and our like family, our community, our country as more important than others, then this is what leads us to have the thought to say, kill hundreds of thousands of people, to harm others in such drastic ways. It all really draws back to that fundamental kind of thought. And so fundamentally holding ourselves as important and sort of our community, our family, our country as important is not necessarily destructive so long as we are not harming others. So long as, even if we say aren't able to benefit them, as long as we are able to refrain from harming, that is something that is good. But most of the time when we have this thought of I and hold that I, that self, to be more important than others, we do engage in activities that are harmful like that create negative karma, and we end up creating harm and so forth. But so going back to this quotation from the sutra, it again connects this with the example of a chariot. So just as one speaks of a chariot in dependence upon a collection of parts, we speak conventionally of a sentient being upon the aggregates. So conventionally speaking, there is something that we can talk about it as being a sentient being, but there is no such self or I as it appears to us. And as much as we are able to, we should try to avoid causing harm from that kind of idea, and as much as we are able to benefit others as well. So here, this it continues by saying that so as we come to understand that the self it doesn't actually exist in any of these kinds of 7 ways or any of the ways that it appears to us to exist, then we should investigate, we should sort of take and apply the mind to other phenomena. So here when it comes to the self, we can say that it is designated on the basis of the aggregates, but we can't actually find the self within the aggregates or find something that we can point to as being that thing. And so too, we should apply this to all other kinds of phenomena, expand this out and place the mind in an understanding that nothing else beyond the sort of self has that kind of existence either. So we might look at, say, the basis of designation and think, well, okay, the self is something that is merely designated on that basis, but that basis is truly existent. Well, then one investigates and analyzes and comes to see that that too doesn't have the kind of autonomous real existence that it appears to have. Even the basis of designation is like the mind like the self lacking in any kind of autonomous or sort of existence from its own side. So when we talk about selflessness, there's a selflessness of the person and the selflessness of phenomena. And so establishing that the person doesn't truly really exist, doesn't have sort of inherent existence, isn't ultimately existent, that is the selflessness of the person. And the selflessness of phenomena entails looking at phenomena besides the person and recognizing that they are not ultimately existent, not truly existent, not established in their own right. And so for Prasangikas in particular, all phenomena are identified as being selfless. When we talk about a self, we might want to think of like a person, but really this is something that applies to both a person and all other phenomena. So as we had quoted last time, where it says that all of this is without its own power, therefore there is no self. So when it comes to either phenomena other than the person, things like external phenomena, sounds and sights and tastes and touch and so forth, and all those kinds of phenomena that are included within the 18 constituents other than the person, or whether we are talking about the person, their lack of that kind of autonomy, of having their own sort of existence in their own right, or true existence, this is what is being discussed in relation to both phenomena and the person. And so that selflessness equally applies to both. So here, with regards to these points, this is really, we should remember in relation to the kind of view of Ha Shang, who was asserting that in order to get rid of our various afflictions, we don't want to engage with an antidote, because that's just going to sort of proliferate our conceptual thinking. Instead, he advocated that in order to remove all of our sort of wrong conceptions, we just need to place the mind in nothingness. We need to think about nothing whatsoever, and that in his mind would act as an antidote. And so here, all of this is being taught in order to rebuff that kind of wrong view, because this is something that needs to be known by wisdom. It is by cultivating wisdom that we are able to counteract the kind of ignorance that acts as the fundamental cause of samsara. So this is why we engage in this investigation of using our own wisdom, whether we are looking into whether the self and the only aggregates or could be one and multiple, that kind of reasoning, or looking into this five-fold analysis or the seven-fold analysis. All of these are in order to be able to extricate that cause of our suffering within samsara. We have to get at that grasping at a self by actually cultivating the antidote to it, the proper sort of knowledge. So we need to know what is actually sort of wrong with the way that we are perceiving things in order to be able to extricate that wrong view. So here, there's a quotation from Dhammakirti's Paramanavartaka where he talks about this, that we need to actually sort of understand the way in which our grasping is wrong in order to uproot that. And it's only by doing so that we are able to remove the result. So again, it's by stopping the cause of something that we can stop the result. So much as we are able to come to an understanding of selflessness, so much are we able to avert that kind of grasping at a self. And slowly over time, we can eventually get rid of the root of samsara. So Aryadeva too has said in the 400 verses that it is by realizing selflessness, by seeing selflessness, that we can stop the root of samsara. It doesn't happen otherwise. So here, as for picking up from the text, in the text where we had left off last time, now there's a paragraph missing in the English version. So I'll just go back through what we might have missed. It says, so last time we had begun by examining these sort of external phenomena and examining that they can't have some sort of real, true existence. And so here, beginning in the text, it says, therefore, due to grasping tightly and incorrectly at such things as form and so forth over beginningless time, the mind itself appears to ordinary people as form and so forth, separate and external, just like the appearance of form and so forth that are perceived in a dream. In that in the ultimate sense, form and so forth do not exist separate from being an aspect of mind, should be analyzed. So one begins by examining external phenomena. And then one turns to, but one who has the thought that the realms are just mind, having understood that everything is that is designated as phenomena is only mind, comes to think, when this mind is analyzed specifically, that it is an analysis of the nature of all phenomena. Thus, he would specifically analyze the nature of mind. Such a person analyzes in this way. So here, one begins by examining how it is that external phenomena can't exist sort of ultimately, really, truly. And then one begins to turn toward the mind. So first, examining that that all of the three realms are just in the nature of mind, one comes to the conclusion that such external phenomena can't exist in the way that they appear to. And then one begins to examine the ultimate nature of mind. So in the ultimate sense, this is continuing back where we have in the text, the mind too cannot be real. So how could the mind that apprehends only the false nature or physical form and so forth, and appears in various aspects, be real? Just as physical forms and so forth, which are false, it too is false. So one begins by examining these kinds of external phenomenon, looking at, well, they appear as if they had some sort of real, true existence, but they actually are false in that they don't exist in the way that they appear. We can have this kind of like illusion of, say, horses and elephants and so forth, and they appear to us as like real horses and elephants, but they don't actually exist in that way. They are false kind of objects. And so too, when we examine the kind of external physical forms, we see that these things are false, that they appear in various aspects, but they are actually in the nature, sort of not existing in the way that they appear. And so too, with the mind that is perceiving them, since that mind does not exist separately from physical forms and so forth, which are false, it too is false. Just as physical forms and so forth possess various aspects and their identities are neither one nor many. Similarly, since the mind is not different from them, its identity too is neither one nor many. So here we have these kinds of various appearances that come to mind, and one can see that those appearances don't exist as they appear. And so too, one should turn the examination to that mind to which they appear, recognizing that that mind too doesn't actually exist as it appears. So here, when one then is doing this kind of examination, in the way that when we are trying to find these external kind of objects and they are unfindable, so too when we try to find a mind that exists in the way that it appears, we can't actually get to that. It's ultimately unobservable if we're trying to find some sort of mind that has a real, true, ultimate existence. So here, just as with physical forms and so forth, which are and so forth are false, since the mind does not exist separately from the physical forms and so forth, which are false, it too is false. So just as physical forms and so forth possess various aspects and their identities are neither one nor many, similarly, since the mind is not different from them, its identity too is neither one nor many. So again, we kind of examine in this way, beginning with external phenomenon, then turning to the mind, and see that the mind can't actually exist in this sort of autonomous, independent, truly existent way that it appears to us. And so the mind too doesn't have an identity as either one or many. Therefore, the mind by nature is like an illusion. So, like when an illusionist or a magician conjures up like horses and elephants and so forth, for those that are observing or watching this magic show, there's both the appearance of these horses and elephants and grasping at them as being real. We sort of apprehend them and have that kind of clinging to them as real. So, too, with the appearance of our mind and external phenomena. Now, in the case of that example, an illusionist may be able to recognize or understand that his illusions are not truly existent, but they will still appear to him that way. He just won't have that sort of grasping at them. But for us, all of this, our mind, as well as all phenomena, continuing into the next paragraph, analyze that just like the mind, the nature of all phenomena too is like an illusion. So although our mind appears to exist ultimately, when we search for it, when we try to find it, there's no such mind that exists like that. And so too are all phenomena. So as it explains here, they should be understood to be like an illusion. So, in this way, then, when the identity of the mind is specifically examined by wisdom, in the ultimate sense, it is perceived neither within nor without. So here we're examining whether or not the mind itself is really, truly autonomously existent, and one does so in this kind of through this sort of examination and analysis. Now, is the mind perceived either within or without? And it continues, it is also not perceived in the absence of both. So here, one is investigating and analyzing, looking for the mind, and it continues this examination with wisdom by looking at neither the mind of the past nor that of the future, nor that of the present is perceived. When the mind is born, it comes from nowhere. When it ceases, it goes nowhere because it is inapprehensible, undemonstrable, and non-physical. So if we try to identify or sort of locate the mind, well, where actually is the mind? We can't observe it sort of anywhere outside, nor can we find something even within the mind, because when we look at the individual moments of mind, well, is it the mind of the past? No, that's already gone. Is it the mind of the future? No, that's yet to come. Is it the mind of now? Well, that's constantly changing. And we would have to then look into, well, there's the arising of this present mind, and it's abiding and it's ceasing and so forth. And when one begins to investigate and analyze in that way, the mind is then becomes inapprehensible. It's not something that we can perceive as existing in this way that it appears to us. So, here, when it comes to, again, this mind that we have, the mind, it has, when we try to search for, unlike the kind of form of somebody, and now generally when we designate, say, a person, we often do so on the basis of their form, but it's not on the basis of their form alone. We also are doing that designation on the basis of all of the aggregates combined. And so when we look then, in particular, at the kind of nature of mind, when we try to sort of look at what is mind, mind doesn't have any kind of physical form to it. There's no sort of color. There's no substantial thing that we can point to as being the mind. And so when it comes to sort of the basis for designating the I, it is both on the designation of the aggregates, but there's a content, again, our form aggregate is newly established in each life. So although there's no continuity between the form of this life and future lives, there is a continuity of our mental continuum, particularly this very subtle mental continuum that is supported by the body in a sort of conventional sense, but it isn't like of a single nature of the body. There is the physical and the body, and then there is the mind. And so the body can act as a support for the mind. But when we are speaking about sort of the basis of designating the self. Now, normally we tend to heavily associate that with the form aggregate, but really when we're talking about the kind of continuity of aggregates, including the mental aggregate that continue through multiple lives, we do so on the basis of all of those. And so when we are trying to talk about, assert that there is some kind of when we are trying to talk about the mind as having some kind of it being the basis of designation, we can say that this is we can assert that it is sort of the basis of designating the self that continues through multiple lives. But this is based upon the understanding that there is a fundamental difference between form and mind. And here, this sort of mental continuity, and this is something that we can see, like when we're say going to sleep or we pass out, and there's our mental consciousness comes back even in those absence of consciousness. This is really an essential part of the basis of designation of